Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 416A, side 1, November 23rd, 1979. There's been so much covered in the newspapers and the news media about Iran in the last 3 weeks that I'm going to take a week off, except for a few mentions of the subject, and get back to it possibly next week, but update the regular listeners and new listeners to other material that's going on that may slip by us at the same time if we give all of our attention to that subject. And you can pick up a lot in the news whenever an event is covered so thoroughly. I like to sidestep it if possible and go to the parts of the news that are not noticed at the time that are happening at the same time. So this week I'm not going to do much about Iran. I just do want to mention that our presidential candidate, ours, because he is very much part of this country, Ronald Reagan, had an interview last week, and he charged that the United States gave the Shah of Iran the wrong advice. He said that when there was dissension there, that he should have put down the rioters and the religious people there, that it was up to the Shah to be strong. Several years before, the Shah had shot into the streets, into the students, and that was one of the things that made him so unpopular there. And Reagan said there's certain leaders who could have been separated from their followers, and they weren't. He suggested that they should have thrown the students and the Islamic leaders into jail. In quotes, they would have been justified because they were inciting riots and causing death and destruction. And then when a reporter pointed out to him that the Shah already had the jails full of leaders of anti-Shah factions, Ronald Reagan said, well, I didn't know about those people on the scene, and he wasn't aware, supposedly, that the jails were filled with people who opposed the Shah of Iran. His solution was to gun them down and put them in jail and silence the religious leaders and the students. Watch Ronald Reagan. He is really the made-over Nixon, the Fuhrer, the puppet of the Defense Department, and he will give you a full-scale war. He already said that his policy would be nothing like the Vietnamese policy. He was one of those that would have made it entire parking place, gunned it down, and put concrete and asphalt over the whole country, and he said that he wouldn't think twice. He said, we don't want peace at the price of freedom, and his definition of freedom is to be in control of every situation without the Soviet Union existing. So Ronald Reagan's very first statement after declaring himself a candidate for president of the United States was that the Shah should have put all of the dissenters into prison. And that's what Adolf Hitler did, so that there were no voices of opposition in any of the Nazi countries. Reagan was on the Today Show last week, and he said, if I'm elected, I'll be the youngest leader of a major country, with the exception of Margaret Thatcher. And Tom Brokaw said, how about Giscard d'Estaing in France? And Ronald Reagan said, who? He didn't even know the president of France. He only knows that there is the United States and there is Russia, and they were going to meet head on, and anyone else in the middle, forget about it. That's not his department. I received a letter from one of the subscribers to the tapes asking me what I thought of Amnesty International. I think very highly of it. I wish there were more organizations like it. I wish they had the budget that we have for rockets and space shuttle systems. Amnesty started in May 1961. A London lawyer began the organization, and in 1975, they had already adopted over 2,000 cases, and they were instrumental in releasing prisoners, about 1,688, up to 1975. And they've been very active in trying to work in Argentina and South America. I don't have the figures of how many they have released in the years from 75 to 79. I'll give you the address if you want to write to them and get information from them in literature, or you can look it up at the library. I'll give you one address. And I think it's good to keep informed on what they are doing, and if you can, send them $1 or $2 or 10 or whatever you want to help support them, because they do call attention to these dictatorships. And the important thing about them is that when men come along like Ronald Reagan, who say they don't know that there were these prisons, and this kind of a character has been running for president for so many years, you can pull out the literature and show that it has been published and where it's been published, or put it in his hands and make him aware and make him backtrack some of his statements if you can, or when you see him campaigning, confront him with this literature. If you don't have it yourself, you can't confront him with it, and that's the important thing about having it in your hands and becoming familiar with it. Joan Baez was on Buckley's show. I don't know if any of you saw that firing line with William Buckley, and I was very impressed with the way she handled it, and she was with a woman from Amnesty International, and of course they're favoring nonviolence and putting down weapons and warfare, and the interview was very interesting, and I'm glad that Jane Fonda and Joan Baez are out there doing their political work. I wish there were more women doing it. It doesn't matter whether they agree with each other or not, as long as they are helping some people, the benefit spreads all around. The bickering between them, I think, has to be put aside. I personally don't like Joan Baez, and I have differences with her, but I respect her tremendously for what she's doing, and she's done it with a consistency. And so it isn't a fly-by-night project. She believes it, and she knows it, and she's educated into nonviolence and into matters like Amnesty International. So if you have any doubts about it, I say no organization is totally perfect, but they certainly are doing a good job, and there's nobody to take their place. Nobody's doing what they're trying to do. If and when the Shah leaves the United States, I will do one tape on the medical reports from the time he left Mexico until he left the United States to show you how it was covered in the United States and around the world. The newspaper articles referred to sources said physicians treating the Shah, or a spokesman for New York Cornell Hospital Medical Center. Then another article, medical treatment in New York, and so forth. They have never yet had an interview that I've noticed with the doctor or named the physicians who would stand up and back up their diagnosis that this is what the man had. The doctors are absolutely faceless, and most of the United Press, Associated Press stories just say that the officials are working through Chase Manhattan Bank Chairman David Rockefeller, and it's Mr. Rockefeller's spokesman who met the press regarding the Shah's illness. But the medical doctors, the men who got their medical degrees, are not the ones who are seen. They're not identified by name, and they won't put themselves on the line to say that he did have these diseases at all. The New Republic had a short article about Ted Kennedy, and it mentioned, in quotes, "This time, for the first time, Kennedy supported an overall increase in defense spending. As late as 1978, this was before he was to become the candidate this year, although he knew he was running, he helped sponsor George McGovern's bill in the Senate to transfer 4% of the Pentagon budget to domestic programs." And that was in 1978. In 1979, Ted Kennedy is running for president, and he is for an increase in military spending right across the board. I wrote a letter to the Vatican asking about the Pope's background at Solvay Chemical and the company owned by IG Farben, and would they deny or discuss in any way his having been at Auschwitz, working there in an executive kind of job, while all the various people are being exterminated, 10,000 or more a day, that he was employed at Auschwitz during World War II and then went on and with Montini, Secretary of the Vatican, in Rome. I got no letter from the Vatican, of course. I got no letter response from the White House. I contacted them. Then I read that an Archbishop, John Quinn, from San Francisco, accompanied John Paul II through his entire trip around the United States. There was a picture of him in the San Francisco Chronicle and an article of the tour of the Pope in the United States. So I wrote to him, and I said, as a concerned citizen, this bothers me, and I sent him a couple of sheets that were enclosed that go with the tapes on the Vatican and IG Farben. And I said it would be awfully good to put my mind to rest and other people's minds to rest on whether or not this Pope was part of that extermination machinery that used slave labor, and now he's violently anti-communist and carrying on the same political beliefs that Adolf Hitler had and worked at Auschwitz. I got a letter back from the Archdiocese of San Francisco. Dear Ms. Brussell, on behalf of Archbishop John Quinn, I would like to acknowledge the receipt of your letter dated October 27, 1979. The Archbishop is not in a position to respond to the questions that you raised in your letter. He's not in a position to respond to the questions I raised. If you believe you need to speak to someone in the Catholic Church regarding these issues raised, may I suggest you contact one of the local priests in your area. Sincerely yours in Christ, Reverend Donald S. D'Angelo, Secretary to the Archbishop. That reminds me of the letter I sent to the publishers and the agents of the book Alternative 3, asking if there was a Sir William Ballantyne, if the book was fiction or nonfiction, And you remember I got a non-answer back. This letter it doesn't say these are shocking things that you have said. How could you say such a thing? I'm sure he wasn't involved. We'll check into it for you. I didn't get that. It said we're not in a position to respond to your questions. I've noticed that when you get to sticky questions, no matter who the officials are, they respond the way the Warren Commission did after they closed shop or while they were working. You can't get an answer from these people. But I'm kind of a persistent person, so I'll call the pastor at the mission, and after the holidays are over, he's busy with the Christmas and so forth, and I'll sit down and tell him my fears and see if he can check it out through the Archbishop to just reaffirm my mind. You see, I don't think that they will be able to deny that this Pope did, in fact, work for I.G. Farben, and I believe he still works for them now, for Prince Bernhard and his Nazi connections, and for the Bilderbergers and the Jimmy Carter team. There's a tight web there, and I just want to keep confirming this in my own mind, and a non-answer helps me get more stubborn on the subject. I also wrote a letter to the General Services Administration, the John Kennedy Library in Waltham, Massachusetts. I read an article on the opening of the library, and I didn't like the way the news story covered it. It told about the glories of the rocking chair and the memorabilia of John Kennedy. They have tapes of the broadcastings, of his assassination and his various books. They have 24,000 volumes on politics in the era that John Kennedy lived. And they asked him something about the assassination buffs, and the chief archivist made some remark like, oh no, if we had the stuff here, they would swarm into this place. It was that kind of thing. I had the feeling it was like one Southern restaurant long ago. If you opened the door to one block, they'd all come in. And he went on to say, we have the National Archives as a repository for the information on Kennedy's death, so they wouldn't have any reason to come up here, or else we'd be flooded. Well, that really got my dander up, so I wrote a letter to him and said that I have this library on the Kennedy assassination and these books on the assassination and the cross-filing of the commission hearings, and that I'm building my own library for people to study the assassinations, or I'd like to. But what I want to do is project it off into a few years, and it isn't built yet, and I don't have the time or money to get into it right now. And I said, if I were to pass away tomorrow or the next week or a year from now or any time before I get my own library started and put together an index, would you accept these books at your library on the John Kennedy assassination? In other words, I would will the whole library to you, where people could come and study there. I have a feeling that I want researchers there, but I'm not sure. And I said I would specify that it all be delivered to you in one piece, and that way the library wouldn't be broken up. So he wrote to me, this is from William Moss, the chief archivist of the John F. Kennedy Library, National Archives and Records Service, Waltham, Massachusetts. And it's still run by the government. It's the General Services Administration. Dear Ms. Brussell, in response to your letter of October 27th and the questions it contained, I offered the following. As you no doubt know, the records of the Warren Commission are in the National Archives, and therefore it is an appropriate place for people to go if they want to examine these records. Now, I have copies of many of the archives documents, and I want to put them up in Massachusetts because there's a lot of universities in Massachusetts, and people don't get to Washington. And that would be the natural place to study it, in the Kennedy Library, instead of having to go to Washington, D.C., because of all these campuses and the activity in the New England area. He said there's no plan to transfer the Washington records to the Kennedy Library, and they don't plan to have duplicate sets of the records of the Kennedy assassination. We have not excluded the assassination from the library. It appears as a fact in the course of our exhibits. It is mentioned and covered in detail in numerous books in our printed collection of 24,000 volumes. I cannot tell you whether or not we would accept your collection of material until we have a chance to see a complete listing of it, to determine to what extent it duplicates material we already have, or to what extent it offers unique material. Storage space is carefully planned to determine how much they can accept. However, there is no bar in principle to our accepting the kind of material you describe generally in your letter of October 27th, which means then that I take a complete listing of my library of what the material is, how it's put together, and how the books are divided into various sections, and then offer it to them and see if they want it. So that he said, in principle, there's no reason not to. Let us know what you have and we'll consider it. And speaking of the assassination of John Kennedy, I do get lots of mail and telephone calls. When am I going to discuss the new book, the Final Assassinations Report from the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and give a critique on that book that the committee did and spent $6 million investigating the murder of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King. I think I'll just do a little bit, maybe every 2 or 3 weeks, sections of the book and report and keep you updated in that way. There's one section here on the Secret Service in the assassination that I'll share with you now because there are some really interesting sections of the report, and I have ordered the hearings, and I'll be getting those shortly. The Village Voice had an article in August 23rd, 1976, by Dick Russell. The title of the article was, "Does the Second Oswald Live in Dallas?" And many of you know I'm working right now on a book on the second Oswald, and the part that shows up in this report I'll share with you here one section of because I think it's particularly interesting. This article by Russell tells about a man, Frank Ellsworth, an agent for alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, and he was interviewed in 1976 for the Village Voice, and he said that at the time of the assassination, just prior to it, he had arrested a man on a firearms charge and released him just days before the assassination. And this man had the bond was put up and he was out. And then November 22nd, 1963, when Frank Ellsworth went to the Dallas jail after Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested, and he saw the suspect that they had pulled in for the 2 assassinations, Lee Harvey Oswald was a dead ringer, absolute double, or the man that he had arrested on the firearms charge was an absolute double of Lee Harvey Oswald. He said, in quotes, he was an absolute dead ringer for Oswald. He had the same build, the same weight, the same coloring, the same facial features and hair. They sounded a little different, but of course there were no tape recordings in the Dallas jail for us to hear which man's voice was in that jail when they were picked up. He said they could have passed for each other. Now, the person that he had picked up that he said was Lee Harvey Oswald's double, dead ringer, was very active in the anti-Castro Cuban community in Dallas, Texas, and also with anti-Castro Cubans that went to Mexico on gun running. And, you know, there were doubles, or maybe you don't know, of Lee Harvey Oswald meeting with anti-Castro Cubans in Miami, New Orleans, and in Dallas. And this double had strong connections with H.L. Hunt, the oil man, and Jack Ruby was in contact with the offices of H.L. Hunt, with H.L. Hunt and Lamar Hunt. And this double also was active with General Walker. There were charges that Lee Harvey Oswald had attempted to shoot at General Walker in April of '63, and yet the witnesses who saw a car fleeing there saw 2 men in the car. And this person was active with the Minutemen and still lives in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And the most important thing about this Oswald double, well, there's several important points I want to make, is that he had a gun shop. The man's name is John Thomas Mason, and he had a gun shop. He purchased 10 boxes of 6.5 Mannlicher Carcano Western Cartridge Company ammunition. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald was supposed to have ordered a rifle from Klein's in Chicago, and a pistol and ammunition from California. But there never was any tracing in 16 years of ammunition for the rifle that was supposedly shot at the Texas School Book Depository. And this man, in early 1963, sold 10 boxes of this ammunition to individuals and sold out that ammunition. Now, Oswald's doubles were at the rifle range, and people saw him with this high-powered scope, making good shots, and that you could shoot the bullets, the ammunition out, and keep the shells and plant them later. Pristine bullets, or that didn't go through the bodies of John Kennedy or John Connally, and you could keep the shells and plant them on the 6th floor of the book depository and match them to the rifle. If the rifle was planted, and if the shells were planted, and if men were at the depository looking like Lee Harvey Oswald and had the ammunition that fit his rifle, you would think that the person that this agent was talking about, Ellsworth, would be very important in Washington, D.C. and in Texas after the assassination. Now, the Warren Commission interviewed him, Mr. Ellsworth, the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms man, in April 16th of 1964. And they interviewed him about his knowledge of arms traffic in Texas. And he told them three things. He said that when JFK was assassinated, that no information was given to the government on activity of Cubans in Dallas. He talked about an organization known as the Minutemen that could have been associated with the assassination of President Kennedy. And he talked about the Minutemen closely tied to General Walker and H.L. Hunt. But in the interview with the Warren Commission, the affidavit, there was absolutely no mention of the Oswald double, or the use of this dead ringer, and the use of the double in terms of the accessibility to the ammunition that would fit that rifle, or the rifle range, or looking very much like him. Now, the interesting thing is that after the assassination, Mr. Ellsworth says that the state of Texas, the federal government, and the local police department were all aware of Lee Harvey Oswald's twin. The Warren Commission didn't mention anything about him, and there is nothing, even to this day, in the National Archives about it. And the Mr. Mason, the man that had the ammunition, was interviewed after Kennedy was killed. But Frank Ellsworth, from Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, was familiar and worked with this man and had released him. He arrested him, released him on the firearms charges. He knew his appearance very well. Then he went to the jail. I don't know why an agent from Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms was in the jail with Lee Harvey Oswald and FBI agent Hosty after the assassination. He shows up in the jail and recognizes Oswald as being the man who had this ammunition and so forth. But in the House Select Committee report on assassinations that just came out, on pages 228 to 230, for those of you who have the report, the new House Select Committee on Assassinations was ruling out three categories of conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination that didn't exist. Of course, all of this is part of their major lies and cover-up. They ruled out the Secret Service role in conspiracy, the FBI, and the CIA, which was impossible to do, and of course we'll analyze each of these separately. But there were allegations after the assassination that people on the Grassy Knoll area were identified as Secret Service agents, and they weren't Secret Service agents after all. And this could look like a conspiracy because people involved in the murder or helping the assassins get away, if somebody ran towards them, a man pulls his badge and says, "Oh, I'm Secret Service," and the other officials depart thinking the area is covered, where he actually is impersonating Secret Service. So in this report, the new report, they go into the allegations that a Secret Service agent was on the Grassy Knoll, and they investigate certain personnel and try to find out who saw Secret Service men, because the Secret Service has said, no, we didn't have anybody. Then the House Select Committee interviewed a Dallas police officer named Joseph Smith, and Smith was riding in the motorcade. He was on a motorcycle at the time Kennedy was killed, and he ran up the Grassy Knoll right after the shooting, and he was looking for suspicious individuals, and a man pulled out cards and said he was a Secret Service agent and had credentials. So the Dallas police officer didn't check them. He just went away and proceeded because this man was there and represented the Secret Service. Well, the House Select Committee on Assassinations tried to identify who Patrolman Smith was speaking to, and they did interview FBI agent James Hosty. That's the man from the FBI that worked with Ruth Paine and Marina Oswald and Lee Harvey Oswald. And Hosty was also in the jail immediately after Kennedy was killed. But that would make sense because he knew Oswald and the family. It makes more sense than Ellsworth being in the jail at the time, Frank Ellsworth. But Hosty told the House Select Committee that Frank Ellsworth, the same man that was familiar with the Oswald doubles and the ammunition and the H.L. Hunt, General Walker, Minutemen, Alpha 66 connections, this Frank Ellsworth was an agent of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, Hosty said, and that he indicated that he was the person who was on the Grassy Knoll passing himself off as a Secret Service agent when the policeman came by. So the House Select Committee got in touch with Frank Ellsworth, who from Tobacco, Firearms, and Treasury Department, who, in quotes, indicated he had been on the grassy knoll area for some reason, and he identified himself to someone as a Secret Service agent. The committee deposed Ellsworth, who denied Hoste's allegations. Now, Ellsworth was called as a witness, and the point is that when the House Select Committee met again, they still, for the second time around, did not get into why would he be on the grassy knoll, and what were the denials, and what was the truth, and how much was he working with the Oswald doubles, because as you'll see, if I ever get this book written, I'm working on it, one, Oswald left from the back of the building and went into a bus and then a cab and then walked a few blocks home to his boarding house, the room he rented. The other one heard a car honk and ran down from the grassy knoll area where Mr. Ellsworth would have been standing as a Secret Service agent if there was an Oswald double, because he ran into a car that belonged to Michael and Ruth Payne, the same people that FBI agent Hoste had visited 2 weeks earlier. And this Oswald jumps into a car and goes off, and that's the one that Sheriff Craig said that he saw. And the man later said, yes, he was Lee Harvey Oswald. The point being that there could be this double that Ellsworth was working with all the time, and then the one that left the back of the building. I know that's complicated if you haven't studied the Oswald doubles, but I think the important point I'm trying to make here is that the House Select Committee on Assassinations interviewed a man, this Ellsworth, who would be very important to untangling the conspiracy in Dallas of the anti-Castro Cubans, the H.L. Hunt, and the far right wing, the Minutemen, the teamwork of the Texas team behind the assassinations. They had this guy, and here again, he for some reason was using Secret Service credentials and knew about the doubles, and he says the double still lives in Texas. He knows where he lives, and the House Select Committee obviously isn't going to go see him. He remains named. He's older, 30 pounds heavier, and he's still living there, but they spent $6 million and didn't interview him. In whitewashing the role of the Secret Service with the Kennedy assassination on page 230 of this book, it goes on to say that the military did obtain evidence that the military intelligence personnel did identify themselves as Secret Service, and that there were 8 to 12 military intelligence people in plain clothes in Dallas the day of the Kennedy assassination who, if questioned, said they were Secret Service agents. So you have, we know, the researchers who've done a lot of work know it was a military takeover in 1963, that you have plainclothes military people from the Defense Department admittedly spread around Dallas at the time of the assassination, and if anybody wanted to know who they were, they could say Secret Service, and they had the credentials, and that makes it really kosher, as if we have all these people to protect the president, so it wasn't our fault. Actually, he was in a nest of spies with false identification, so that you did get a military takeover, and the Defense Department had their agents there disguised as Secret Service. That's how the suspects leave town. That's how they all got away. I'm sure that the men being escorted out of Dallas that were photographed there with police uniforms were also military intelligence in disguise. They've gone so far to admit that they did have agents there, but you see, the House Select Committee didn't ask the head of the Pentagon, who was called as a witness, to bring those 12 military intelligence agents to the committee and photograph them now and see what position they were in, if they were at Dealey Plaza or with any of the suspects taken away. They've admitted they had the agents there, and they get off scot-free. And then the report says, based on its entire investigation, the committee found no evidence of Secret Service complicity in the assassination. But it doesn't say, based on its investigation, the committee found no evidence of military intelligence complicity, because they didn't go into it. They just went into the Secret Service and said, well, our Secret Service agents weren't involved because the Defense Department used Secret Service identity. The logic of the investigators is so interesting to understand, and the small print is interesting to understand. And once you read it, and you read it carefully and lay it next to the evidence, you can figure out how these conspiracies work, because that is the lingo of the cover-up, and it's used on every single case. It really doesn't change. I'm sorry about all this dismal news. Maybe we'll turn over this tape and I'll think of something happy to bring to you on the other side, okay? Maybe I'll think of a joke. This is side 2 of tape 416. It's Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, November 23rd, 1979. I do see this war game escalating. It isn't a joke, and I can't think of anything funny for this side. So maybe each week we should just run down the sabers rattling and get it off our chest, and call attention to certain articles that are leading us directly into the conflict. So we have the record on the tapes. It was obvious, I guess, from 1933 up till 1939, that World War II was inevitable, maybe from 1930 on. But it's that progression of information that is available that people don't want to see. And if I put it on the tapes and print it up on the sheets loud and clear and disseminate it as far as I can or as far as you can, then later people can't have an excuse to say they didn't know if we don't reach a large audience like the mass media, of course, but every little bit helps to bring up the awareness of what is going on. The White House had a feud over Brzezinski's trip. There was an article in the papers last week. He went on to offer arms to Morocco, and this is causing a consternation. Now, former UN Ambassador Andrew Young is angry at the route that Jimmy Carter's taking in the Caribbean, cooking up a false Cold War issue against the Soviet Union, and also the the decision of Carter to send arms to Morocco. Brzezinski has promised that he will get active into the 4-year-old Sahara War, and again, we're going to put arms on the side of Morocco against Algeria. I just can't believe how this thing is rolling along. Of course, I've said all along, the two biggest problems in the entire world are Brzezinski and Kissinger. A Nazi and a Polish Nazi, and they have led us down the drain, and they're directing the whole scenario with the Rockefellers and the corporations into that grand World War III. Evans and Novak had an article just 2 weeks ago, Brzezinski gets his say, and it tells how he takes his top defense strategist for the National Security Council. There was a conflict there, and he's pulled in Air Force Major Jasper Welch, Jr., the expert on U.S.-Soviet affairs, and pushed his friend. He had an advisor, a Mr. Aaron, that he worked with closely, and their relationship has cooled down, and he's pulling in tighter people from the Pentagon, experts on the Soviet Union in preparation for the Soviet War. Another article this last week, Carter says he'll provide money for the space shuttle. The space program is having trouble getting off the ground. Its parts are not working or functioning at various levels. We can go into details on it if you want, but Carter is giving them the money they need to build it up. Last week I finished the tape talking about the shuttle funding that the Senate was giving to the Pentagon, some of those figures, disastrous figures, and I didn't get a chance to say that they're giving $12.4 million for security modification in Houston. I mentioned that once before on a tape with regard to Alternative 3, and the space program, the book, with the allegations that the space shuttle stations are for genocide and slave labor. In case those of you don't have those tapes, you can order those. But the secrecy at Houston, which really should be plenty now to guard whatever they're doing, is increased now. There have been too many leaks, so they're including a $12.4 million to modify the secret aspects of the space shuttle. Now that's interesting. If we're working with the Soviet Union on space programs together, I don't know why we're paying $12 million to make more secure what the space shuttle is about. There was an article, a little comment in the paper, also several weeks ago, that the King of Saudi Arabia, King Khalid of Saudi Arabia, gave Jimmy Carter an extra present on Independence Day, July the 4th, and he promised 1 million extra barrels of Saudi Arabian oil each day for the United States. And somebody was commenting or asking in the newspaper columnist, what was this gift that we were to get 1 million extra barrels a day? And the answer was that the diplomats believed that that extra allotment would be in return for an understanding of the U.S. and tilt their policy towards the PLO, and that this was the turning point, that Carter accepted the extra gasoline to eliminate the gas shortage that would come during his administration, and then his politics would get down and be more patient with the PLO. And of course, Arafat is coming to the United Nations next month. The PLO are getting recognition. I don't believe that they shouldn't. I believe that they should have had it all along and not build up to this point of bartering and blackmail. But the point is that the PLO are surfacing now as a very viable group, and part of the agreement was in July the 4th when Jimmy Carter made the deal with the King of Saudi Arabia to release some of the gas pressure at that time. Of course, all of the Arab countries want to get rid of Israel, and instead of Saudi Arabia attacking them, they fund the money and weapons to the PLO, who needle Israel from the other end, and it gives them not a clean hand because they're overt on their hatred of Israel, but it diversifies the intensity against Israel, and it puts lovely pressure on the White House. Another article about Margaret Thatcher. She's really getting tough in Britain with her immigration and her policies of cutting down on domestic affairs. I mentioned those last week. This week, the Soviet Union had an article that she's creating international tension and stepping up the arms race. Brzezinski was described in the New York Times, another article. Brzezinski seeking stronger influence, reorganizing his staff to bolster his authority over the Pentagon and the State Department. This article suggests that Jimmy Carter may be a lame duck president. And I mentioned this again last week on my fear that they'll create a war, and that this bringing in this Mr. Welch that was an expert in Soviet affairs, and he's also a specialist in nuclear weapons. Brzezinski is going to tighten his hold over the Pentagon and the State Department. And this is important. When Kissinger did that, we had those lovely bombings over Cambodia and the terrible crimes against all Southeast Asia that were going on under the Nixon administration. And this is one of the things I fear, is that if the war is cooked up in the Middle East, it's because Mr. Brzezinski and Major General Jasper Welch Jr. and that gang don't want to give up their hold over the State Department and the Pentagon. And if they think that Jimmy Carter couldn't win the election, they would give you a war first on the basis of national security and declare war. And I think that those are the advisors that are leading Jimmy Carter to train the troops, send the warships out, on the edge of Iran, and cook up a war. If they think they're going to lose their power, if their boss is going to be out in one more year, and that means then they would be out also, they may as well cook up this confrontation right now and maintain their power. And these articles about Brzezinski wanting stronger influence, the guy should be hung up by his heels. The fact that he wants more influence and is controlling both the Pentagon and the National Security Council and the White House is very dangerous, and the State Department. So you follow events the way he moves and the way the troops move, and the way Carter could slip down in the polls could be a reason to give us a war. I want to give you an address on the tapes, or on the sheets that go with the tape, of an organization that does fantastic work. And I don't know if you've ever read their columns. They're in the Washington Post and in the New York Times every week. It's a group called Promoting Enduring Peace, P.O. Box 103, Woodmont, Connecticut, 06460. Howard Frazier, Executive Director. And they have articles. They just finished a 12-part article, the last of a series. It's a tax-exempt foundation for peace, and they have wonderful authors, experts against fascism, against Nazi war criminals. This last article they had, Whom the Gods Would Destroy, they first made, and it talks about the weapon budgets and computerized death and the use of machines to handle our nuclear weapons and their interconnection with communication networks and so forth. It's a very important series of articles. They run them continuously. You can make your checks to this group. Promoting Enduring Peace is the name of the group. it might be good for a holiday gift to give this as a subscription to friends or young people you know, nieces, nephews, brothers, sisters. I've mentioned books as a gift, research, and I'm sure most of you have that list. If not, you can get the address from me again. Books and articles are the best gift of peace that you can have. And I think a subscription to this group, and you can write and ask for their articles. I won't share with you the entire context of this particular column, but they're about 14 inches long, and they describe Mr. Brzezinski and the National Security Council and how far right the American Security Council is. And it's a very important series of articles. It's an important collection of people who are trying to have peace in the world. There are these groups, but of course they're in one location and far away. They never heard of me. I'm not in contact with them personally. And it's a shame that we don't get together and meet and know each other and have a broader range of people rather than separate groups fighting. But if it has to be that way, it will. But I do think that you should be turned on to these groups and their columns in case you don't get them in your local community. The Washington Post has an interview with Andrew Young, who played the game all the way up to the top, and then because of one meeting in New York City was fired. And now he's warning Jimmy Carter that he may lose the black vote because of his attacks on Cuba and arming Morocco. As I say, what Andrew Young doesn't know is that the president doesn't need elections. He can just declare a war, and he doesn't need black votes either, because he's pleasing more of the white military establishment that make a point of getting out to vote than the black people that aren't even going to the polls to vote. They don't study the issues enough. They're diversified, just trying to make a buck in this society, or becoming integrated into it. And only when he was fired could Andrew Young come out and say the things he's saying now. When he's part of the system, he was part of the system. Now that he's fired, he's making more sense. And there's nothing like unemployment or being pushed aside from a position where you thought you were part of the inner team to get your senses going and really come out and speak out about the president's policies now. He's more valuable once he's unemployed or not in the White House than he was in the White House. There was a long article in the Los Angeles Times several weeks ago on, it's called The Crime Clearinghouse, and it's about Interpol. It was written by Don Cook, whoever he is. The article is important enough to be reproduced on the West Coast, not only in the Los Angeles Times, but in the San Francisco Chronicle and in the Monterey Herald. I don't know if it was syndicated in the East Coast or not. It went under various headings. The Interpol remains indispensable link in fight against organized crime. Another title, The Clearinghouse Interpol. And the box in the article says, there's one little quotation from the article, J. Edgar Hoover would have nothing to do with Interpol, but times are changed. Interpol stands for International Police. I did make some tapes. I looked back at the sheets on Interpol back in 1978. Tape 306, 315, and 316 have to do with the drug traffic and Interpol and the connections of the Nazis. So I'm not going to repeat that. You can get that, but I do want to correct certain points in this article and bring out matters of Interpol, because it does affect all of our lives, and a lot of people are not aware of the organization. Whenever large articles come out of this type, whitewashing the organization, then it's time to counteract with a repetition of what they really are. And this article tries to say that a group of very nice police officers of the international type met together in Vienna and then went to Germany at the time of Adolf Hitler. But J. Edgar Hoover, this is in quotes, the U.S. attitude towards Interpol in that period of Nazi Germany was one of contempt and hostility. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover wanted nothing to do with it. He did not believe in exchanging information with anybody. Now, that is not true. J. Edgar Hoover worked with Interpol. He was vice president of the Interpol. We've had a liaison with it in Washington, D.C., and it's part of our Justice Department and the Treasury Department. And J. Edgar Hoover was very familiar with those international Nazis. And he was vice president at the time that the president of Interpol was one of Hitler's Nazi teams also. Now, this group does not interfere in cases of former Nazis or major, they don't have police functions to arrest, but they do harass a lot of people, and it's their excuse to keep files and documentation on people all over the world. The Bilderberg organization, which was set up by Prince Bernhard, a member from Hitler's Gestapo. He now is married to Queen Juliana, has been for years in the Netherlands, worked with David Rockefeller at Chase Manhattan Bank and Henry Kissinger to have the secret organization, and with Mr. Brzezinski and Alexander Haig, to control a great part of the world and escalate the war for the third time against the Soviet Union. And one of the active Bilderberg participants in 1978, of course, was Lars Larson, Deputy Chief Inspector of the Exterior Information Bureau, Vice Director of Interpol. Interpol is definitely part of the Bilderberg trilateral group, and it does keep track of revolutionaries and political movement, and it is a repository of information about people who you can trust to come into this country, who is turned down, and it's a collection of the worst fascists in the entire world, and the head of Interpol is part of the Bilderberg group. From 1940 to 1942, Reinhard Heydrich was head of Nazi police chief. He was in charge of the SS, and he was the president of Interpol in Nazi Germany. And up to 1939, just before 1940, when Heydrich was president, J. Edgar Hoover was in correspondence with all the top Nazis, Goering and Goebbels and all of them, and then he was advised to cut it off during the war years. It would look bad. Interpol in 1938 to 1940, before Heydrich came on, was run by Gestapo Colonel Otto Steinhausel, and he was the head of Interpol. And the president of Interpol from 1943 to 46, when the war was over and the Nazis were being sent all over the world, was Ernest Kaltenbrunner, head of the Nazi police. Paul Dickopf, who was a member of the Stormtroopers, has SS number 337259, was president of Interpol 1968 to 72. These were the Watergate years when the United States Treasury was giving money to Interpol. The Interpol offices, the United States branches in our Treasury Department in Washington, D.C., and Gerald Ford had gotten an attorney, G. Gordon Liddy, from New York State to come to Washington to work for the Treasury Department, with their offices right next to the international Nazi organization of Interpol. Was Mr. Dickopf, president of Interpol from 68 to 72, who helped reorganize the German police at the end of World War II and lead them together cohesively up until 1952. And he's headed the German Nazi police department, and then went on during the Watergate years to have people like Liddy, who were working with Robert Mardian in the National Archives. They were allegedly watching Gestapo pictures and learning Gestapo training. The can of worms of Interpol continued from Vienna to Berlin to Belgium into France, and our agent, J. Edgar Hoover, and our Treasury Department have been a part of that system and the data banks. And because Watergate was equated with a total Mormon operation, and the Mormon vaults in Salt Lake City have the genealogy of people all over the earth going back to the year 600, every single family, every person marked. I believe that Interpol will be the backbone for rounding up and gathering people later for their future exterminations. And the candidate Ronald Reagan says the Shah should have taken all the religious opponents and the students or rioters and pulled them in. I believe that Ronald Reagan, as the President of the United States, will have access to every person's political belief, and that it is salted away, because the man running his campaign is Paul Laxalt, who worked with the youth organizations and the strong Mormon data bank organization. And this candidate would be the sum total of having access to the information to get rid of all opponents, which he has proclaimed the second day after he announced his candidacy is what he would do to stop opposition, just put them in jail. It's a very interesting newsletter that comes out that you might want to subscribe to. It's expensive, but it has some interesting information. It's called Double Eagle, and it's mailed out by the man. He calls himself the Tsarevich, the man with the right to the imperial throne of Russia, the Tsarevich and Grand Duke Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov of Russia. And he came into this country as an agent of the Central Intelligence Agency, and under the name of Michael Galinaski. And he's been working for the CIA for years, And he has a newsletter, and I'll give you the address. It's at Murray Hill Station in New York City. Whether he's Galinaski, which is his alias, or the heir to the Russian throne, I don't know. But he has information which is very interesting, and half of what he says I have heard from other sources, and a lot of what he says is true, and I think it's worth delving into. And he writes about the Nazis that worked in Interpol, and he has a lot to say about Reinhard Heydrich. You know, Heydrich was supposed to have been killed in 1942, a car blown up, and again, the people involved were taken away, and that was excuse for more extermination of Jews. Heydrich was the man, not only as president of Interpol, but a man in charge of the final solution for getting rid of all the Jews in the world. And Galinaski claims that Heydrich wasn't killed. Now, he'd have no reason to say that, I don't believe, but he claims that he came to this country to organize the movement for the Nazis inside the United States at the height of the war, that they said he was dead, and that Nelson Rockefeller brought him to the United States, and he went under the name of Guy Richards. And Galinaski claims that Guy Richards wrote books about the Tsar and the Tsar's family that were untrue, but the man who died recently in New York City, the author by the name of Guy Richards, is not Richards at all, but was Heydrich, brought here by British and U.S. intelligence to work with Nelson Rockefeller and form the Nazi movement in the United States. And then he also writes about Himmler, Heinrich Himmler, and his being in the United States. And I think that's interesting because when I was in New York a few years ago, I was told that Himmler was a writer and a reporter in New York City, and that he hadn't died in Germany. I'd like to read with you just a couple of sentences because it's hard to translate. He writes in English, but it is broken English. He obviously is not a born American. He must have come from Eastern Europe. And I'd just like to read a few sentences from his newsletter of March 79 from his, it's called the Double Eagle, his newsletter. The parts about Prince Bernhard and the Bilderbergers, because I say again that the Pope, John Paul II, and this whole clique are all part of this inner Nazi circle. And I'd like to read to you what he says, looking at it from a different point of view of a white Russian, whether he's a Tsar's son or not, an agent that has worked and been brought here by the CIA. He says the Bilderberg movement he refers to Bilderberger, in 1977, various newspapers were reporting that Prince Bernhard, former head of the Bilderberg and still very closely associated to this super inside organization, was regaining the admiration of the Dutch a year after it was disclosed that he had solicited $6 million in sales commissions from Lockheed Aircraft. By 1977, they forgot about the scandals of 1976. In result of Bilderberger's inspiration, in July of 77, the Organization of Dutch Exporters voted him the Man of the Year. However, Prince Bernhard was forced to resign many of his positions, including the most prominent as head of the Bilderberger since that scandal. Since the end of last year, Prince Bernhard found himself in an astonishing news in the Netherlands in the midst of more serious allegations already causing tremors in various networks in Western Europe and the United States. Among others, the weekly New Review in Netherlands claimed that in 1938, Prince Bernhard received 100,000 Reichsmarks from Hitler's SS intelligence service, headed at this time by SS General Heydrich, Reinhard Heydrich, in exchange for Dutch military secrets. It is known that the German-born Prince Bernhard was at one time a member of Hitler's SS elite organization, and during the last years it could be observed that Prince Bernhard, together with Lord Mountbatten of England, were often protecting the position towards semi-hidden SS murderers, among them incredible stories about them being disguised as reporters, such as Guy Richards, the former chief of the SS security office, who was really Reinhard Heydrich, that he brought him into the Netherlands. He was causing patriotic fury, and he brought him to the Netherlands and then to the United States. A magazine in the Netherlands has proof, absolute proof, that the Bilderberg chieftain, Prince Bernhard, frequently corresponded with Hitler in 1942. This is at the height of the war, and they're charging him with taking information and assisting Adolf Hitler through the whole war. And he offered to assume the royal regency in occupied Holland in the absence of the Queen. Despite the very strict libel laws in Holland and the fact that the Dutch royal government normally prosecute what is judged to be slander against the monarchy, the exposures of the prince's Nazi past and its SS ramifications is given added credence because nothing is being done about those charges. The Weekly New Review and certain other Dutch newspapers have detected some contacts of the Bilderberg Prince Bernhard with hiding criminals of Nazi Germany and stepped up their aggressiveness to expose these truths about the Nazis at this time. It has to do with the gang of the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers, and the Dutch reporters are going into the hidden SS mass murderers who are among us, and they're among the U.S. President and select committees, and there have been complaints made to the President of the United States, to the investigative arms of the intelligence community, to the FBI, to the United States Attorney in New York City, and yet they won't do anything to investigate this particular man, this Guy Richards, that he claims was the blonde beast Heydrich from Germany that did go into New York City with the assistance of Lord Mountbatten and Prince Bernhard. It was an article in the New York Times, January the 5th, 1979. Guy Richards, at age 73, passed away. A former city editor of the journal American, they described him as an author that lived at 340 East 57th Street in Manhattan. He was 73 years old. A writer for the New York newspapers from 1954 and 1956. He won awards. He wrote several books about Tsarist Russia, Imperial Agent, The Hunt for the Tsar, and The Rescue of the Romanovs. And the allegations are made that the biography of Mr. Richards, that he went to Yale in 1927, are fake, and that he went on a Whitney expedition to the Solomon Islands and so forth are fake. They have him working with the Marines in Guadalcanal at World War II. Mr. Golinovsky, or the heir to the Russian throne, whichever way you want it, the prince, who's to believe or who's to know, claims that Heydrich did not die, that there was no proof to his death, and that he was Guy Richards, and that he was very instrumental with Rockefeller and the news media in New York City. Golinovsky claims that this Guy Richards was protected in New York City, that he had connections with the CIA, the Secret Service. It's interesting, he keeps bringing up Prince Bernhard and Lord Mountbatten, who was recently assassinated, as working with this Nazi team very closely. And he said they set up a monstrous net of U.S. agencies and the city's authorities, including the Department of the Police, which notoriously protected Heydrich Richards from extradition trial in Germany based on the Nuremberg trials. And they discovered, too, the role of Heydrich when they appealed Nelson Rockefeller, who was a former governor of the state and vice president of the United States, and a close associate of the Bilderberger gang. This is what Golinovsky is writing. They concealed all evidence of the links of Heydrich to the Nazi chains in the United States and the setup or the continuation of Nazis in the United States. Golinovsky wrote in his newsletter, while Nelson Rockefeller protected Heydrich in New York City, he also did more, and this reporter discovered that Rockefeller's last chairman for the re-election committee of the governor of the state of New York was one of the associates of Heinrich Himmler and Heydrich, the dog Reinhard Heydrich, and it was promoted by Nazis to the rank of a general major. Dr. V. Glasgow, Glaskow, remember that name, of New York City, who during World War II was the commander-in-chief of a Cossack troop fighting with the armed forces of the Nazi Wehrmacht. In this capacity, Dr. Glasgow was on the staff of the SS leader Himmler, and indirectly also with Prince Bernhard, of the now chairman of the Bilderbergers, or head of the Bilderbergers. And he asked the question why a powerful politician such as Nelson Rockefeller or David Rockefeller and members of the Republican Party would have somebody such as this General Major Glasgow working with them in capacity in New York State with these prime jobs. That's an interesting question, and I don't know if Golinovsky or the prince, were part of the inner Nazi team. If he really were, he wouldn't be exposing more Nazis. And he's almost credible for what he says he is, because he's desperate to get his recognition or his share of the money that Chase Manhattan and banks stole from them, and they would be totally bankrupt if he actually were the heir to the throne. So he keeps attacking the Nazi connections to the Rockefellers more than even attacks the Soviet Union for taking away their family or their holdings, if he is indeed that person, or even working for the Central Intelligence Agency or the defense. They brought him here from Eastern Europe. He is attacking the dangerous situation of having the Nazis run the state of New York and trying to call attention that they do, in fact, live and run there. Well, our time is running out again. That's an update on some of the things I've had on my desk for you to share with you. There's hundreds more and never enough time. Next week we'll go back to a little bit more of the news and maybe some longer stories such as this that have been here that I do want to share with you. Have a good week. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, and I'll be back with you next week.